Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades, this is Amali Shatila. I'm chairman of the African People's Socialist Party and leader of the Uhuru movement and the International African Revolution. I want to welcome you to today's live. There are some things that I think we need to talk about. One of the things that's really significant, and I'm sure various peoples around the world are watching this, is Joe Biden, U.S. president, has embarked on a global trek beginning on today. And it is something that the rulers of this country and much of Europe recognize as having really powerful implications for the future, for the stability of Europe, for the stability of the United States and the colonial capitalist project altogether. We're reminded of this when we look at how the sectors of the ruling class are treating this question, Biden's trip. There is something that recently appeared in the Washington Post, and an opinion piece, and it is titled, "Can Biden Save the West?" And in fact, that's the basis of the theme that we came up for this live, or I came up for this live to share with you on today. The fact is that a major bourgeois newspaper with a global imprint around the world of the U.S. colonial ruling class would even raise the question of the need for the West to be saved is really interesting. And I think it's testimony to the depth of the crisis that we've been talking about for some time now. Because this piece that's in the Washington Post is something that's taken from what they characterize as today's worldview. It's an analysis from the Post. It is something that's coming from the thinking representatives of the colonial capitalist ruling class. These are people whose job it is, whose responsibility it is to try to provide some kind of analysis, some kind of direction, some kind of understanding of the state of the world and the state of the place of the United States in this colonial capitalist world. And so the question that it raises, can Biden save the West? And what we recognize is this means actually, can Biden save the past? And I want to just give you some excerpts from this today's worldview newsletter that's been put forth by the Washington Post. This analysis, as they call it. I'm going to read just a little from it because I think it's really important for you to understand this. Because every day we look up and people who profess to be our leaders and people who and sometimes these are people in our own colonized communities around the world. These are people who who are self-professed, brilliant, and well-learned people who want to explain the world for us. And usually what they are providing us with is something that reflects the worldview of their colonial capitalist masters, the bosses, the one who really runs this ragged, terroristic entity that we have to live with and try to function in every day of our lives. And so we start off with just an excerpt from this presentation by the Washington Post article analysis, if you will. And it says that President Biden has lofty ambitions for his trip to Europe. He heads off Wednesday, that is today, for a week-long tour that includes meetings with Queen Elizabeth II, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and most of Europe's democratic elected leaders. At summits of the Group of Seven Nations and NATO, Biden intends to rally traditional American allies who were perturbed by the political volatility of his predecessor. Biden has cast the coming decade as a global clash between liberal democracies and autocratic powers like China, and sees the proceedings this week as the opening chapter of a new era of competition. So this is how Biden is characterizing this as a new era of competition but it's more than that. And his European interlocutors are enthused. America is back. The European Council President Charles Michel told reporters on Monday, echoing Biden's own slogan after a half-decade in which President Donald Trump had chipped away at some of the pillars of the transatlantic alliance. It means that we have a very strong partner to promote the multilateral approach, a big difference with the Trump administrator. And this is what's coming from Charles Michel or Michel. Trump, and so it goes further. It says Trump's America's First doctrine provoked a real anxiety among the policy-making elite of Washington and Brussels, who started to question the deeper ideological bonds uniting their countries. In his indifference to liberty and contempt for self-government at home and abroad, Donald Trump is the first non-Western president, of the United States, wrote Michael Kimmich, author of The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy. So in 2020, the organizers of the annual Munich Security Conference floated the concept of restlessness, a recognition of the perceived decay of the Western project. The next year, the conference theme was more optimistically dubbed Beyond Restlessness, and his briefing paper suggested the new president, that is to say Biden, had a chance to reinvigorate the West. Biden addressed the gathering virtually declaring that, yes, America is back. Of course, this is the article continuing, and this is where it really gets helpful. It says, of course, the idea of the West is itself rather fuzzy. It's not a meaningful geographic term because invocations of the West rarely encompass the nations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and usually do include Australia, and New Zealand. Journalists, including today's worldview, that is the thing that I'm quoting from to now, deployed the West as shorthand to mean something contradictory, sometimes contradictory sets of concepts. It can define a cultural identity anchored in theory in centuries of both Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman tradition. It can represent a political brand built on a bedrock of liberal democratic values. It can comprise a legacy of imperial abuse, a link to a still unreconciled history of colonialism and racism. It can be a vestige of the Cold War, seen most tangibly in NATO, the world's preeminent military alliance. So the point here is that this thing that they call the West, that they're talking about in terms of the West, concept terms that's used commonly, even by people who you know, even by people who are supposed to be a part of our movement, the struggle that we are engaged in for self-determination, the struggle that we engaged in for the destruction of colonial capitalism and for the advent of a new world of free people, free Africa under the leadership of the African working class in concert with oppressed nations globally represented by their advanced sector, the workers. So this West thing really clearly means it's white power. It is not just white power, it is colonial white power. It is the power of the colonizers. And so when we say that, when they're asking, can Biden save the West? What they're talking about is can Biden, what they really mean is can Biden save the past? Because colonialism, which gave rise to the whole imperial project, imperialism stems from, the capitalist system comes from colonialism. We don't get to the West during feudalism. Feudalism is a time where Europe, the mode of production in Europe was revolved around the peasants and the serfs tied to the land, controlled by the landlords and the nobility and things like that. These separate little entities, these separate little fiefdoms that existed in this constant state of war and what have you with each other, separate entities. That was feudalism. But that was not the West. In fact, that was not even Europe at this time. What we had were just these different entities identified primarily in relationship to themselves. You know, you had the Normans, you had the Celts, you had these different groups of entities that would become Europe and that would become the West. And how do they become Europe? They become Europe and they become the West through expanding, through moving out of these feudal entities and engaging in the slave trade as it was characterized, the assault on Africa, the emergent the colonial project that went even beyond Africa, created all of what we know as the Americas, which has its origin too in what they characterize as the slave trade. We call it the colonial slave trade. That spread throughout the world, and it was the West, as we know, the Europe, got its identification now in relationship to this movement of aggression and attacks on Africans and other peoples around the world whose lands and resources they stole. And upon this foundation, they created a social system that's known as capitalism. They created an identity that sometimes is called the West. It has been called different things. It has been called Christendom. It has been called Europe. It is called Europe, but that is the West. And so the West that we are talking about is something that has its origin in colonial slavery, colonialism, generally speaking, as it happened throughout the world. That's what we're looking at when we talk about the West. And so the question of whether, and this is something that has defined the world, has created and defined the political and economic configuration of the planet Earth for the last few hundred years, with its origin, with its beginning, being in the attack by Portugal on Africa in 1415. This is where you have the origin of the West. This is the history that has relegated Africa and our people to states of servitude, to states of oppression, insecurity, etc. This is where it comes from. So here you have the West. The West is something born of colonialism. The West is something that where we see the emergence of capitalism as white power. White power comes into existence through this colonial project. Colonial capitalism gives rise to what we now know as the West, which is why we say that when they ask if Biden can save the West, what they're asking is, can Biden save the past? Because the position of the African People's Socialist Party is that we exist within an uneasy equilibrium right now in this history, this contest, this crisis of the social system that we will say something about moving forward. This crisis is part of a contest that exists between the past of colonialism, enslaved people, and the future. And the future represents a free people where the African workers and other working peoples of the world have possession of our own capacity to do labor and to benefit from that which we produce collectively. So that's what it is that we're talking about. And so we say that when they ask the question, can Biden save the West? They're asking the question of, can Biden save the past? And you can't save the past. The past is gone. Not only can you not save the past, we do not even give you the right and the ability anymore to define the past. George Orwell, who was a British guy, who wrote some time ago that who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And that's how it's been up until now. And so we have a shaky situation now that has asked the question from the Washington Post, thinking representative of the colonial white power, is, can Biden save the West? Can Biden save the past? Can Biden, and that's a critical question, because we're saying, no, he cannot save the past, because who controls the past controls the future. And it's the intrusion of African and other oppressed peoples in this process, fighting for that, to take control of the past, to define the past, so that we don't engage in emptiness as they would have us engage in. And also, it contributes to our ability to have a much weightier discussion than what our colonial existence usually allows us to participate in. So let's go a little further in this discussion, because and as a part of the statement, as a part of recognition of the contradiction that the rulers are experiencing. And when I say the recognition, I'm not just talking about our recognition of it. I'm saying that the thinking representatives of white power of colonial capitalism themselves recognize that this is a real fundamental point in history, an existential crisis for the social system, an existential crisis for the system that came into being. They call it capitalism. We say it's colonial capitalism that was born from the enslavement of African and other oppressed peoples around the world. This is what they are talking about. So here, reading a bit more from this today's Washington Post analysis, it says that in 2020, the organizers of the annual Munich Security Conference floated the concept of restlessness, a recognition of the perceived decay of the Western project. The next year, the conference theme was more optimistically dubbed Beyond Restlessness, and its briefing paper suggested the new president, that is to say Biden, had a chance to reinvigorate the West. So this is something that's happening in Munich, where hundreds of people are coming together, thinking representatives of colonial capitalism, coming together to discuss the critical questions of the moment and to try and come up with directions. And one of the issues that they're dealing with is this concept of restlessness. And just think about this. Here, the thinking representative of colonial white power having to put on the agenda the issue of whether they are going to disappear, which is what restlessness means. And so what it says here, moving forward in the discussion, said, of course, the idea of the West is itself rather fuzzy. It's not a meaningful geographic term because invocations of the West rarely encompass the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean, and usually do include Australia and New Zealand, white countries, all of which are connected to, born of colonial capitalism. So it says, for Biden, the West that arguably matters combines the hard power of NATO with the more universal ideals of liberal democratic states. He seeks to convene a summit of democracies later this year or next, but will get the ball rolling at the G7 summit in Britain, whose host, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has also extended invitations to Australia, South Korea, and India amid discussions of a new D12 alliance of democracies. And so here, Boris Johnson from England is trying to extend the reach and participation to get more people on the side of the West by including Australia and what they call South Korea and India, and creating a so-called new D10 or Democratic 10 alliance of democracies. So this is what it is that they're talking about. This is really an extraordinary situation that speaks to the uneasiness of the rulers of this country. They're thinking representatives trying to see the future. We've talked about this before. This is one of the difficulties that imperialism has, colonial capitalism has at this time, because it cannot see the future. And that's why we've said before, even in the popular culture, what you would see from the colonial capitalist system is you would see like movies and things like that revolving around zombies, the dead, the walking dead, and vampires, the living dead, because they can't see the future. They move. Sometimes they will try to rescue these images of the Superman. So you see a reintroduction of Superman that's supposed to represent imperialism when it was strong and powerful, etc. But today they're asking the question of whether the West can even continue to exist, or whether white power can continue to exist. And they quote this person who I'm reading from, this article from the Washington Post, looks at a new poll of European attitudes by the European Council on Foreign Relations, and said that majorities in a number of sizable European nations believe the European project is broken. Majorities in many European countries also view the United States political system as either completely broken or somewhat broken, and that's 4 months into Biden's presidency. So there's still a widespread lack of confidence in the United States' ability to come back as the leader of the West. This is what they are talking about. And again, this is from the European Council on Foreign Relations. And it's really important to mention this because what we see is that there are many people of our own people who are supposed to be leaders, who are fearful of what the United States is doing and how it's doing. But this crisis is deep and profound. Let me share something else with you quickly, if I may, because this is not a new thing for the African People's Socialist Party. We recognized this a long time ago in the political report, my political report to the Seventh Congress of the African People's Socialist Party that occurred in 2018. You heard what I've just said about what they are worrying about and what crisis they are looking at and how they are defining it and experience this crisis. So 2018, we said here, the deepening crisis of imperialism, the tipping point of the uneasy equilibrium. I'm using the term uneasy equilibrium, and I can't do it without chuckling a little bit, because here I'm looking at something. This is something different. This is a report on global trends, 2040, that's put forth by it's a publication of the National Intelligence Council of the United States. This is March 2021. And I'm just mentioning this because of just how they are defining some things that's happening in the world. And they say here, in terms of they say that there are key themes that they are looking at and looking at their world from 2021 through 2040. And one thing they have here is disequilibrium. They say the scale of transnational challenges and the emerging implications of fragmentation are exceeding the capacity of existing systems and structures, highlighting the third theme, disequilibrium. And so they're saying the same thing that this meeting in Munich, in terms of the Council, the Munich Security Council, they're speaking of the same thing. And they're asking the question here more dramatically with the Munich meeting about the restlessness, the disappearance of the West as a economic and political force in the world. So here's what we say in 2018 at the Seventh Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. The deepening crisis of imperialism, the tipping point of the uneasy equilibrium. You hear this term equilibrium. I wonder if they read this political report. I truly do. And you will see the analysis here that we put forth. The Washington Post is 3 years late in what it has to say about this. We say the unending wars waged by the U.S. from one end of the earth to the other are evidence of the crisis of imperialism. Perhaps the greatest example of imperialist crisis today, however, can be found in the White House, the seat of U.S. governmental power. Every day there's a new scandal associated with the regime of U.S. President Donald Trump. A host of explanations is being advanced by the thinking representatives of the white ruling class for why the Trump administration continues to be embroiled in crippling controversy. The struggle being waged against his regime by other sectors of the white ruling class is extraordinary. The Trump regime, it says, it's not really fundamentally different from Obama or anything like that. We go on to say that we have said all along, we said Trump regime is not fundamentally different from the Obama regime that preceded it, and is certainly not a departure from the predatory colonial capitalist campaign of Hillary Clinton, his 2016 Democratic Party opponent, who's lost to Trump, sent shock waves through the white ruling class elite. And that was not just in the United States, throughout the world. It was shocking, well, the election of Trump. And you must understand this, that you have this interconnected, this global colonial capitalist system, and you have this system with different factions connected to it with different specific economic and political interests that's often in contest with each other. So we said that we have said all along that the electoral process is simply a vehicle for nonviolent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. Nothing clarifies this fact more than the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign and Trump's election. Then we go and say a lot more than that. But one thing that's really important, we quote in this book, the political report to our Seventh Congress about we quote to support the analysis that we're putting forth. We quote Zygmunt Brzezinski, who was an advisor to Obama, and who also was the national security advisor for James Earl Carter, who was what many romantic liberals like to think of as the honest president of the United States, if it were possible to be such a creature as an honest president in the United States. But here's what Brzezinski had to say in terms of more or less the same thing we've been saying all along. He says, global political awakening is historically anti-imperialist, politically anti-Western, and emotionally increasingly anti-American. In the process, it is setting in motion a major shift in the global center of gravity. That in turn is altering the global distribution of power with major implications for America's role in the world. The foremost geopolitical effect of global political awakening is the demise of the imperial age. Empires have existed throughout history, and in recent time, American paramountcy has been described as a new global empire. So here is what it is that we're dealing with, what I'm saying all along. To save the West is to save empire, is to save imperialism, is to save the past, colonial capitalism. That's what they're involved in. And then we said in the political report to the second plenary of the African People's Socialist Party that occurred in 2020, we talked about this crisis and we expound on it more concisely than we do in the piece that I was reading from the political report to the actual Congress. And we says that imperialism in crisis creates conditions to advance the revolution. The party of professional revolutionaries of the African peoples, of the African working class, has voluntarily assumed custody of the liberation and unification of our Africa and our forcibly dispersed African nation. Imperialism is experiencing obvious disarray. The international bourgeoisie is split in 1,000 different ways. Raging wars and threats of war continue unabated. Traditional bourgeois alliances are under severe stress due to growing competition between parasitic international thieves for shrinking access to the colonial resources. They are fighting over resources violently extracted at the expense of our lives and freedoms and totally necessary for the continued success of the capitalist system globally. The economic configuration of the world is undergoing transformation at this very moment. This is, I guess, what they would be talking about, the creating of restlessness. The economic configuration of the world is undergoing transformation at this very moment. Trade wars between China and the US, the Brexit crisis that has paralyzed England politically and disrupted the strategic assumptions of capitalist development in Europe and the world. The growing split between the wealthy North and poorer South, threatening the future of Spain. The disruptive emergence of an energized, if economically challenged Russia, contesting US hegemony in the Middle East and upsetting the balance of forces in Europe and elsewhere. The audacious China that sometimes aligned with Russia is increasingly willing to openly contend with the US. These are just a few of the examples of imperialism experiencing existential crisis. There are others. Korea, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, most of the Americas. Uninformed and poorly led battles are raging across the African continent. This is complicated by the contest for economic and political advantage between Europe, the US, and former European colonizers. This is a contest that does not have the fully developed advantage of a coherent African internationalist, informed and organized effort by Africans to conquer power in our own name and in our own interest. And so the US is the headquarters of a dying imperialism, as we have known it for the past 70 years at least. It is the center of the storm wreaking havoc with imperialist unity internationally, and in part because of domestic imperialist disunity. So anyway, this is what we've been talking about, and this thing that they're reporting on the Munich Security Council, the report that comes from the Security Council of the United States, the paper that they've done about the global 2040. All of this is stuff that they're simply validating what we've said all along, which is really important for Africans and others to understand that we are dealing with a social system in a state of extreme crisis. And our objective must not be to try to rescue this thing with certain kinds of reforms. We must take the leadership in bringing it down. That's the only way we will become free. That's why the African People's Socialist Party is engaged in revolutionary struggle all around the world, because we recognize that there will be no freedom, no peace for anybody as long as the West continues to dominate the world. And when by the West, what they have meant, of course, is white power. They meant former colonial powers, the imperialists that have their foundation in enslaving the rest of us in the world. What we are saying is that Africans and the oppressed, the colonized peoples of the world, under the leadership of the toiling workers, must come to power. And we cannot do this without a major assault right now on an imperialist system that's experiencing extreme distress. That's what all of this discussion is about. That's what Biden is trying to do. Put it all together again. Let's get along together again. Let's try to come up with the ability to dominate the world again. Let's recreate what we tried to do with first the League of Nations that failed. The United Nations that is on a shaky foundation today, because all of these are simply institutions, or both of these were institutions designed to give some kind of parliamentary and even if you will, democratic control of the world by a handful of European powers at the expense, and these are colonial predatory powers, so that they could have peace. That meant they didn't have to fight each other in order to dominate us, because every war that they've had has been a war between them for control of our resources, control to divide or redivide the world. They're saying we don't have to have a war to divide or redivide the world. Let's create this institution. That's what the United Nations is. That's what the League of Nations attempted to be. So these are some of the implications of what it is that we're talking about now. We have to have our own power. And that means that we have to be recognized that our responsibility is to win freedom from this social system. And this system cannot survive our freedom. That's what they're talking about, how to rescue the West. Is save the West, save imperialism, save the past. And we're saying that the past cannot be saved. And you cannot save imperialism. You cannot save this thing that you call the West. That the African people and the peoples of the world must be free. The African People's Socialist Party was founded with the understanding that we had to complete that revolution that was started in the 60s by oppressed peoples all around the world. You ought to join it if you can. And to do that, just go to apspuhuru.org. apspuhuru.org. Biden cannot save the West, but the African People's Socialist Party can lead the revolutionary movement that would bring down this whole social system based on parasitism and the theft and resources and freedoms of the peoples of the world. Uhuru, apspuhuru.org.